Welcome to the third installment of The Conquered and the Proud, this overview of Roman history and particularly the expansion of the Roman Empire, its consolidation and its development, and the impact it had on the Romans themselves and the people who were conquered, absorbed, or had to live next door to the Roman Empire. Now we're returning to something that we mentioned briefly right at the beginning, and we're looking at 200 BC, and we're going to ask a simple question, because in that year, the Romans declared war on Philip V of Macedon, and they embarked on another major campaign. Now, this is barely a year after they've completed this arduous conflict with the Carthaginians, led by Hannibal in particular, the Second Punic War, as we know it, taking on from the Romans. And that had lasted from 218 BC through to 201. And it had been fought to a great extent in Italy, though eventually the Romans were able to expand the conflict and fight in Macedonia, in Spain, in Sicily, and in North Africa. But it had cost the Romans immense losses in terms of life, which had severely depleted their military manpower. It had struck at the very heart of the Roman system, in that within the first few years of the war, over a third of the Senate were killed, and many more families would lose their members of their younger generation as they fought and did what they were supposed to do in Roman society. Political leadership came at the price of military leadership. They were intertwined, therefore you had to play your part, and it was often a very dangerous role to play. So the Romans have suffered huge loss of life. They've suffered huge devastation to the farmland of Italy, because after all, Hannibal has been there for well over a decade. And for much of that time, he was able to move almost at will, devastating the farms owned by Roman citizens, and particularly the aristocrats, but people in general, and the Romans' allies. During the course of that conflict, quite a significant number of allies, especially in the southern part of Italy, had defected to Hannibal, which meant that in the years to come, the Romans then attacked them and devastated their farmland, killed their population, stormed their cities, or blockaded them. So lots of Italy has been caught up in this war, and many, many communities have suffered pretty appalling losses, both in terms of lives, but also economically in terms of the ability to feed themselves. So Rome has come through this struggle that it has won with immense effort, mobilizing to a degree never before matched, and probably never again matched in the Roman experience, with the possible exception of some of the civil wars where you have very large armies wandering around. But the Romans have gone through a phase where they've mustered very many legions, and they've supported them fighting not just in Italy, but abroad. And then within a year, they decide to go and fight Philip V of Macedon. So they're embarking on another war with another major power, perhaps one that's not as big as Carthage, but nevertheless a significant kingdom that they could reasonably expect would not be easy to defeat. So we have to ask why they were willing to do this, and why, when you'd think they might want a breather, they might want to recover, both in terms of their prosperity, their livelihood, but also just that sense of peace at long last. You're no longer under threat. The Republic is no longer threatened with extinction, which it seemed to be for quite a significant period within the Second Punic War. And remember, the previous generation had fought the First Punic War with another considerable loss of life, even if it was mostly fought at sea and around Sicily and didn't affect Italy quite so directly. So you've had these two big wars. You've just come through the second one, which has really pushed you to the brink of destruction and left a huge impact in terms of the devastation it's caused, the demographic gaps. You know, your population might be recovering, but it's not necessarily people of the normal balanced ages. And the aristocratic families have been as subject to this, perhaps more subject to this than everybody else within society. So the Carthaginians have been defeated. You've imposed a 50-year indemnity on them. They have to pay you money every year. They're stripped of their overseas possessions. They have suffered in various other ways just to make sure that the Roman Republic can say they are now subordinate to us, they are now defeated, and hopefully they can't do again what they've just done to us. And yet you very swiftly go into another war. So that's the starting point for this week's talk, because our main focus will be on the next generation or two of conflict with the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. So quite a bit of what we're doing today will be narrative, And we'll tell the stories of the successive wars against the Macedonians, against the Seleucids, the Macedonians again, and involvement in the Greek peninsula in general and further afield in Asia Minor. So the story is important and we need to understand that, but we're also going to try and look at some of the topics we've raised already. So the impact of this on Roman politics, on the ambition, the competition, the rivalries between the senior aristocratic families, the members of the Senate, their competition for high office, for the opportunity to win glory. Remember last time we were talking quite a lot about the prestige of a triumph and that auctoritas, that authority, that reputation that could be added to your name, and that the best way to do that was through military success and fighting the Republic's enemies and defeating them overseas to protect the Republic. That was considered to be the greatest good pretty much anyone could do. So we're looking at issues like that and how they work into it, and a little bit about how the army functions, how the state functions. But let's come back to this starting place. But before we do that, we really ought to look at and remind ourselves of the wider world, just what's going on. So Carthage has been defeated. Carthage has lost its territory in Spain. It's lost its renewed presence in Sicily, in the islands of the Mediterranean. So the Romans now have overseas provinces. They've got 2 of them in Spain. They've got 1 in Sicily. Most of Sicily is still effectively self-governing, but nevertheless it is a Roman sphere of influence, an area dominated by the Romans. You've got Sardinia and Corsica. So the Romans have committed themselves to a substantial number of overseas provinces which require a military presence. Now, sometimes it requires a large military presence because there's active campaigning going on, sometimes less so. They've also nearly always been maintaining 1 or 2 armies under senior magistrates in the north of Italy. Before Hannibal invaded in 218 BC, the Romans had been pushing ever further north, colonizing, settling down these new communities of Roman citizens and allies to farm the land, and they'd come into direct conflict with the predominantly Celtic tribes, the Gallic tribes of what they called Cisalpine Gaul. It's the Gallic areas south of the Alps, the mountain range. Now obviously these communities there, these existing tribes, were not too pleased to see the Romans coming in and trying to take the best land, whether it was taking them directly from them or at least pressuring them, trying to control the markets, and generally behaving with the confidence, the swagger that Romans abroad tended to do because they believed themselves to be citizens of the greatest republic in the world, the greatest state in the world. So there'd been friction there before the Second Punic War, and Hannibal found a very rich source of recruits among the tribes of Cisalpine Gaul when he arrived. And we have to remember, just after Cannae, another Roman army, this time commanded by a praetor, but probably consisting of 2 legions and allies, was wiped out by the Gauls. So they suffered yet another hammer blow, and in that case the Roman commander was supposedly beheaded and his skull was used as a drinking vessel for various ceremonies by the tribes afterwards. So this is a major defeat. So these Gauls have always been serious enemies, and they will continue to be. So there's a lot of focus there. So it's not as if the Romans have stepped out of the war with Hannibal and have complete peace everywhere. They have commitments in Spain, they have commitments in northern Italy, both of which are quite likely to lead to war, or at least have that prospect there. You might end up having to fight major campaigns, commit large numbers of troops and supplies, and pay for that operation for quite a long time to come. And yet, again, they still decide to look to the eastern Mediterranean. Now, as we saw last time, this is an area that's, in effect, it's the sort of the echo, the fragments of Alexander the Great's vast empire, which didn't really do much to outlive the conqueror when he died so young. Now, as we said then, there are 3 major kingdoms that develop. You have the dynasty of the Ptolemies, who based their power around Egypt, though it's modern convention and in practical terms we tend to think of them as an Egyptian kingdom, but their ambitions were always further afield, particularly to islands like Cyprus. But this was a Macedonian successor state that saw itself as a true successor to Alexander and to that culture, that image of power. So it always had its ambitions to push further afield to get more of Alexander's empire and wished to be a presence in Greece, although it was primarily a diplomatic one, but there were connections with Rhodes and others, and the Ptolemies would compete in the Olympic Games and all this sort of thing. So, they were very much part of this Greek world, and you want to be a major player within it. Now, in Macedonia itself, you have the Antigonid dynasty that has eventually been the victor in the competition for power there, controls the old kingdom, or at least the enlarged kingdom, of Philip II, Alexander's father, as much of it as it can, and also, because it's so close to Greece, does its best to have influence, control, power in southern Greece amongst the cities and the leagues. Southern Greece is very much a mixture of, there are still the Athens, Sparta, that's declined greatly since its heyday, Corinth is still important, but Greek cities tend to band together into these leagues which allow them to combine and at least have a chance of competing in the diplomatic and military rivalries that again have followed the successor period, the breakup of Alexander's empire. And in the east you have the major kingdom of the Seleucids that at times, and it's been revived to a great extent under Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, the end of the 3rd century BC and into the period when the Romans come into direct contact with them, pushing as far as what's now Afghanistan in the east, down towards the Gulf, pushing towards Syria it normally controls, Palestine, that area, but not necessarily much of Asia Minor. In Asia Minor you have kingdoms like Pergamum that have developed and have managed to carve out a niche for themselves with their own dynasties. They're nowhere near as big, but they still have a sense that they are legitimate successors to that Macedonian tradition, to that Greek tradition. So these are the empires, the kingdoms with which the Romans will come into contact over the next generation or so. Now, we talked a little bit about them before, but just as a reminder, these are varied in terms of their composition. The Seleucids is geographically the biggest, probably has the largest overall population, but even there, the element that is Greek in terms of its self-identity, in terms of its legal status, so this tends to be city communities, some of them colonies founded for Macedonian and Greek veterans by Alexander, some of them founded by the Seleucid kings. So you have, for instance, Antioch in Syria, one of the greatest cities in the Greek world, founded by one of the early Seleucids. You've got Seleucia on the Tigris, which will in later days become one of the major cities of the Parthian and then the Persian Empire. These are major Greek cities. They have a population that, whatever its ethnic origins, is predominantly Greek-speaking. The language, the law, the religious culture is within that broad Hellenic tradition. There's lots of variety within that, and you could talk at great length about all of these things in detail. But you also have substantial parts of your empire that have existing cultures of their own before the Macedonians arrived that have no real sense of being essentially Greek. So you still have cities like Babylon that has very ancient traditions. You have different communities within your empire who are going on speaking their own languages, are often controlled to a fair degree by their own noblemen, their own elite. They have their own cults, their own traditions. They are part of your greater kingdom. They will provide, in some cases, soldiers, in many more cases, money, resources, food, this sort of thing. They're not Greek as such. Now, somebody raised in one of the comments pointing out that, as I've said, the Romans have this huge citizen body, and that means that their military manpower is on a scale completely outstripping any of the older Greek cities. And in some senses, it also outstrips the manpower of, say, the Seleucids or the others, or at least the manpower that could be considered to be within the Greek tradition in terms of how it fought, how it was willing to act, the sort of command structure, discipline it was willing to follow, and the fighting styles it was willing to use. Roman armies are rather more homogeneous. Seleucid armies have lots of different contingents with different ways of fighting, which can be an advantage, but it also means that you've got to spend time molding them together, getting them used to working as a team. Ptolemies are similar in some respects. They have a large population, but there is a clear distinction between the Greeks and the Egyptians within the Ptolemaic kingdom, and they never really spread Greek culture too far. Some Egyptians do adopt Greek language and Greek customs, at least to some extent in their lives, and participate in the administration and the army. Many do not. Many simply continue living as they have done for millennia in many cases, and they are not they're not really part of the military system. But at times some are raised as troops, but they're not really sufficiently committed to the Ptolemaic dynasty to want to fight and die for them, and certainly to serve in long periods as regular soldiers. Macedonia has the smallest population of the three big kingdoms because it goes back to the old Macedonian kingdom, and it's lost some of the territory that Philip II, Alexander's father, and Alexander had gained. But it is more homogeneously Greek. Even the Macedonians by this stage, there's still distinctions, there's still the Macedonian dialect, but Macedonia had become, in some respects, more a kingdom of cities under Philip II and Alexander than it had ever been before. There is less difference. There is still difference between the Macedonians and southern Greeks, but it's probably less marked by this period. All of these armies have developed but essentially kept to the Macedonian system that was devised by Philip II and Alexander the Great. So the heart of your army remains the heavy infantrymen who don't fight as hoplites, they fight as pikemen. They fight in very close order in a phalanx where you have pikes held two-handed with a shield sort of buckled to your elbow on your left arm, but not something you can wave around a bit and maneuver too much. And Polybius tells us in his famous description of the phalanx that the spearheads of the first 5 ranks project beyond the front of the phalanx. It's a formation that requires you to keep good order, to stay together. It's good in the open, good on the flat. It's not so useful in broken or rugged terrain. It's fairly unwieldy. Generally speaking, you don't get the impression that the phalangites of this era, of the 3rd century BC and particularly into the early 2nd century BC, are of the same quality as the men that Philip had led for so many years and Alexander had taken right the way to India. Partly because those were exceptionally experienced soldiers, very used to victory, but they'd had a long time to get extremely good at what they were doing. So the levels of drill, maneuvering, rapid formation changes, ability to adapt to terrain are rather less true in this later period. Another thing that's less the case is that most of these armies can't muster as many cavalry in proportion as Philip and Alexander in particular, had done. So in certain battles, the weight of the fighting falls more on the pike phalanx than it had been meant to do. That was one element of the combined armed system that Philip II and Alexander the Great had used. It's a little bit harder for the successor armies to do that quite so well. They're not so well balanced, they're not so well mixed, and they're also just not as well trained. There was a very intensive period of fighting after Alexander's death. The funeral games, as they're often referred to, judging from Alexander's comment, the idea that victory should go, the rule should go to the strongest, all this sort of thing, whether true or not, that's what happened. His senior marshals and some of the others who just scented an opportunity and managed to persuade people to follow them became rivals, fought each other intensely for a short time and then periodically. 217 BC, in the middle of the Second Punic War, in the early stages, you've had the Battle of Raphaea between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. That was one of the largest battles recorded in this era. And, it's hard fought because it's between two essentially similar armies in the way they fight, their tactical doctrine, their equipment, and the way they think and act. Now, to try and gain an edge, different armies have developed new techniques. So at Raphaea, famously, there were war elephants on both sides. You also have the Seleucids experimenting with cataphract cavalry, so where the man and the horse is armoured, and with different allied contingents. But these are... It's a sign that you don't have an inherent advantage in the way you fight, which you could say Alexander had when he confronted the Achaemenid Persians and the Indian armies, in that his army was a very well-trained, practiced tactical team, but also it was better at something than almost any opponent it met. When you're fighting someone with all the same doctrine, all the same tradition, you don't have that built-in advantage, so you need an extra edge. And this is the era when military manuals develop advising a general to be very careful about when he decided to commit to battle and to try to gain every possible little edge, little advantage that he could, just to try and shift the balance in his favour, because it isn't built in. You also see the trend towards big numbers when they can get them. So some of these battles like Raphia are massive. But they are still very hard fought, rather unpredictable. They're also, and this is more important and something we'll return to later, they're rare. So by this time you might have the capacity in the military system to develop this very disciplined army with a clear command structure, but you're not mustering it and fighting with it very often. In most cases, particularly against another opponent with the same sort of doctrine. So that's something you have to do sometimes, and you plan for and you think about, but it's not something you do every day. A parallel would be the Carthaginian fleet in the First Punic War, something we referred to right back at the beginning, which gets hammered by the Romans in all but one of the battles, and yet the Carthaginians have a much older maritime tradition. But one of the problems with being the dominant naval power for so long is that you rarely actually have to fight any naval battles. So although the theory is there is a tendency, as with all military systems in peacetime, that you start to focus on the things that don't necessarily work in practical terms, but are more convenient for training or give you a way of showing off, this sort of thing. So you're fighting an army, or a navy in this case, and later with the successor armies that know all the theory, but they haven't necessarily been particularly practiced and experienced at doing it on a large scale in recent years. And that's something that will be a significant difference when we come to these conflicts. So let's go back to the story. Let's go back to 200 BC, and we'll see the Romans declaring war on Philip V of Macedonia, although not initially. Now, the background to this, it's again something where we have to fill in. That's always the problem with any study of history, is where do you start? Because there's always something that's already happened that needs to be explained. This is not the first time that the Romans have fought against Philip V. What modern scholars call the First Macedonian War broke out during the Second Punic War, the big struggle with Carthage, and broke out in 214, lasted until 205. Now, the Romans, before the war with Hannibal, had intervened in Illyria. That's, well, the coastline of, I suppose, Croatia, those areas. It's what was former Yugoslavia, that area, the other side of the Adriatic Sea to Italy. And in the decade before the struggle with Hannibal, there'd been friction with some of the kingdoms and tribes and groups on the other side of the coast, piracy against Roman merchants, diplomatic insults, this sort of thing that had led to Roman intervention by, ironically, one of the people involved was the consul Aemilius Paulus, who gets killed at the Battle of Cannae. His first experience of military service was fighting a very different sort of by land and by sea operation along the eastern coast of the Adriatic. So the Romans have been pushing towards Philip V's kingdom, and again this sense of sort of sphere of influence that you have with these powers in the ancient world, just as the Carthaginians had felt that the Romans were treading onto their turf when they intervened in Sicily, that led to the First Punic War. Philip V has spent much of his reign fighting. He's a bit like Philip II Alexander. He becomes king very young. He's a sort of dashing, brave, clever military leader. And he fights a long succession of campaigns against Illyrians, against Thracians, and particularly against intervening in southern Greece. And he comes up against the Aetolian League, he comes up against other cities. Now, Philip V fights a lot. However, the fairly detailed accounts of these campaigns we get partly from Polybius and elsewhere make it very clear that these are not big battles in the main. Philip V spends a lot of his time with a few thousand cavalry, light troops, not a big pike phalanx, but men who can move quickly. These are wars of raids, of surprise attacks, trying to capture cities, particularly if you can get somebody to open the gate for you, blockades, raids, putting pressure on the enemy. But when battles do occur, they're often large skirmishes rather than major pitched battles, because most of the Greek cities are no longer anywhere near as willing to all don their hoplite armor and go out and meet any enemy in an open field on the borders of their land. It's not what you do anymore. All communities have tended to rely very heavily on mercenaries, on professionals for quite a long time, and they tend to be a little bit reluctant to fight too many pitched battles. So it's a warfare that's to do with controlling trade routes, it's to do with controlling the walled cities, wherever you can, that allow you to control regions. So Philip V has done a lot of that. And he sees the Romans as encroaching on his turf because they've appeared and they're starting to make diplomatic contact with communities that are in southern Greece, as well as the Illyrians, that Philip feels are regions he wants to dominate. Now, this isn't all from the Roman point of view. We will look next time more specifically as a theme at Roman imperialism, at why the Romans are expanding and how they're doing it. But it'll be useful before we get onto that to look at this narrative that we'll do this time. So you have Philip becoming suspicious, because what tends to happen is that when any power arrives in an area, people who are doing badly currently look to that new power as a potential friend, an ally they can use against the long-standing existing rivals that they've got locally. So when the Romans appear, inevitably some communities go to them thinking, well, it might be worth being friends of the Romans, and maybe I can actually use them so that I can have them as a big friend, which means Philip V will have to be a lot more careful what he says to us, what he does to us. So they're intervening in that respect. Philip clearly feels threatened. He also sensed an opportunity. After all, 215 BC, it's just after Cannae in August 216. The Romans have lost 50,000 men killed in a day, plus a lot captured. Hannibal can go where he likes in Italy. Most outsiders would have thought this was the stage when the Romans are going to throw in the towel, they're going to negotiate, and if they don't, Hannibal will just keep on killing them, and eventually they will negotiate, their allies will defect away from them, and it's all over. So if you're going to pick a fight with the Romans on a purely pragmatic viewpoint, then this seems like a good time, because the Romans aren't going to be able to afford to fight you in a big way, and also they're weak, they're vulnerable. If Hannibal's about to impose a peace on them, maybe you can get in on the act and you can make a treaty with them that will allow you to gain most or all of what you want. So Philip's declaration is very much opportunistic. There is no real provocation, even by ancient standards, that he can point to any incident where he can say, well, the Romans have offended me, therefore I need to go to war with them. Now, of course, from the Roman point of view, this is very much a stab in the back. This is by someone who's not an enemy, who's been out there, doesn't have a reason to hate them, who suddenly, when they're really on their last legs, they're faced with Hannibal, suddenly these Macedonians come and declare war on them. And it is a striking thing that even during this crisis of the Second Punic War, the Romans still dispatch a magistrate, allocate him the province of the war with Philip, and they send troops and ships to wage war in southern Greece and against the Macedonians. Most of the war is fought around the coastal areas of southern Greece, which is obviously quite a substantial part of southern Greece. It's not really a war of big battles. Again, that's not what Philip V generally does, but it's not what anybody in Greece is doing much at this time. Now, the Romans are able to do this because they've developed this naval capacity during the first war with Carthage, the First Punic War, and they've maintained not a fleet on quite the scale of that conflict, but nevertheless, they have ships and they know how to build more, they know something about how to crew them. So it's largely about raiding with Greece. The Romans ally with the kingdom of Pergamum over there in Asia Minor. They see Philip as a rival because they'd like to be more influential in Greece, and they also don't want Philip pushing in their direction. And many Greek states, particularly the Aetolian League, but also with Thracians, with Illyrian chieftains. The Aetolians provide the main force on land. Even though the Romans are able to fight this war while they're fighting the Carthaginians on all those other fronts, they can't give it their full resources. They can't really commit to it. It is very much a sideshow. So like most of the commanders in Spain and elsewhere, there's a sense of the Roman leaders here feeling a little bit deprived of resources and men, so that they rely very heavily, more perhaps than the Romans would normally do, on the local allies. And it's the Aetolians that do most of the fighting on land. The Romans really support them. And then to a great extent, it's the Aetolians that call the shots to how this campaign will be fought. And then the Aetolians decide they've got all they want, and in 206 they make peace with Philip and abandon the war. The Romans only do so a year later, by which time they've really realized they don't have the capacity to keep fighting him. But it looks as if by this stage things are going much, much better against Carthage, and they don't have to worry anymore about Philip coming over to join Hannibal in Italy, because that was one of the great fears. There are rumors, you get the tradition that's preserved in Livy and elsewhere, that the Macedonians did actually send troops and that some of them end up at Zama, for instance, but it looks as if this is a later embellishment. It's always possible that mercenaries end up coming from service in southern Greece and perhaps service under Philip and end up taking pay with the Carthaginians, but not on a huge scale, and there certainly doesn't seem to be a major boots on the ground commitment by the Macedonians to the war in Italy or North Africa. Though, of course, that was bound to be a fear because, again, the Adriatic is not that wide. It is navigable, and Philip does have ships because, he's able to do this, he's able to fight this war, he's able to meet the Romans at sea sometimes. So that was a real fear, but by 205, they can't continue, but also the Romans aren't really able to continue at that point. So, in 200 BC, the Romans receive an appeal from a delegation from Athens that asks for help against Philip V. They claim that Philip is mistreating them, abusing them, all this sort of thing. There's also been an appeal from Rhodes and from Pergamum. So again, Pergamum, and these other allies that have been on your side more or less in the greater conflict are complaining that Philip V is not behaving in a good way towards them. So that's the pretext for war. That's the reason why a Roman magistrate can go, this will be debated in the Senate, and he can go to the Roman people and ask them to approve a vote of war against Philip V of Macedon. Now, this is a fairly common pattern, and again, it's something we'll talk about much more next time when we look at the wider theme of imperialism. But if you think back to 218 BC, or 219, 218 BC, the beginning of the Second Punic War, the Romans have allied with the city of Saguntum in Spain. Saguntum is besieged by Hannibal. The Romans send a delegation to complain about this, and to some extent, their pretext for this war is that they've made an ally of someone that's hostile to someone who's been an enemy in the past, and you can see this as a cynical ploy and a sense that the Romans simply want to find an excuse, a pretext for war that makes them look like the good guys. They're the defenders. They're not protecting themselves, but they're protecting a good, loyal friend of theirs, which is part of Rome's majesty, its might, its reputation, was the auctoritas of a state or republic as much, and a people, as much as the auctoritas of an individual. And the Romans take great pride in their fides, their faith. They stick to treaties, all this sort of thing, at least supposedly. That's how they tell it anyway. So you have these appeals that come to Rome, the Senate debates, and this is the most detailed description we have of what follows is by Livy. So he's a historian of the Augustan age, so he's writing best part of 200 years later, a little bit earlier than that, but not by much. And he tells us that the consul Publius Sulpicius Galba presents a motion to the Comitia Centuriata. Now remember the Comitia Centuriata, we talked last time about how the Roman people meet to vote in various assemblies. Comitia Centuriata is the one that's based around the archaic military organization of the state, so you vote in accordance with your assignment to a century, which is based around your military role. So the equestrians who provided the cavalry get to vote first, then your main body of your legions. It works down and down until you get to the poorer people who vote last, and they have greater numbers in each one of their groups, therefore their vote counts for less. So it's generally seen as the most conservative with a small c, the most loyal, simply patriotic of the Roman assemblies. And it favours the opinion of the wealthy and the well-to-do. Now, Galba goes to them and makes this proposal, that it is the will and command of the Roman people that war should be declared on Philip, king of Macedon, and on the Macedonians under his rule, because of wrongs inflicted on the allies of the Roman people and the acts of war committed against them. So this is the proposal, and it's turned down. This is incredibly rare. We hear of very few occasions when the Comitia Centuriata says to a magistrate, no, we're not doing that, sorry, we don't fancy another war. So here we have a situation where one of the two consuls of this year has gone to the Roman people, assembled in great formality in the Comitia Centuriata, suggested and given reasons that clearly, it'd be a good idea for the state if we go to war against Macedonia, and the Roman people has said no. Now, like most politicians, he wasn't too keen on this as an answer, so he summons them to an informal meeting, because the Comitia itself was not a place where you could debate matters or even make speeches. It is essentially, it's organized, it's laid out so that you walk along through various routes and lanes and you drop your ballot in. So he goes to them and he essentially uses two arguments to persuade them to change their minds. The first is this. As far as he's concerned, Philip V is already an enemy. Remember what he did to us. When we had our backs to the wall, when Hannibal was at the gates, he was there marauding around Italy, all those dead at Cannae, all those dead in the other battles, no sign of any prospect of throwing Hannibal out of Italy, possibility the Republic was doomed. Philip V, with no argument, no existing argument between him and us, declares war on us. The stab in the back, the same sort of anger that you could see reflected post Pearl Harbor, where, again, you've had a premeditated but unprovoked attack in an undeclared war. Someone has just decided they're going to attack you because they can, because they feel like it. So there was anger. He was trying to revive that sense of anger that this man is clearly an enemy. Philip V can't be trusted because when we were down before, he fought us and he attacked us when he didn't need to, and he allied with our most dangerous enemy. So that's one. And then he raises the spectre of that dangerous enemy. It's remember Hannibal. Hannibal marched all the way from Spain, crossed the Alps, and then slaughtered us in droves, defeated us in battle after battle, stayed in Italy for over a decade, broke off our allies, devastated our fields. That was Hannibal, and he came all the way from Spain. Philip V is only the other side of the Adriatic. He can sail across and land in Italy in a matter of days, should he want to. So we know this man is an enemy and he isn't far away. Isn't it better if we go and fight him in his own country rather than in ours? Don't wait until we're vulnerable, until we're weak when he comes and hits us again, and maybe a surprise attack, maybe he will come and land and he'll bring an army to Italy which will do all that Hannibal's done. Again, can we take that risk? Or do we go and take him out now, deal with him now, on his own soil, where the farms that'll be devastated, the fields that'll be burned, the crops that'll be consumed by soldiers will all be foreign, not ours. And where if he wins a victory, he's not going to win it just outside Rome where he can start threatening us. It'll be that much further away. And remember Hannibal again, because when he was besieging Saguntum, our ally, remember that, remember them, we went and sent a deputation to tell him to stop, and he didn't, and he just got stronger, he just got bolder, and then he attacked us. So we've got to think of Philip in the same way. If we appease him now, then he's only going to come back even stronger. He is going to despise us, not respect us. We need to show him who's boss now and go and fight him. Now, these are really quite timeless arguments about the balance between diplomacy, appeasement, deterrent, all of these things. To what extent is it better to keep talking to someone and, make allowances, try and do deals, try and compromise, or do you have to talk but from a position of great strength? And that strength will need to be demonstrated at times, and that the only reason he will respect you is if he's also frightened of you. So Galba presents these arguments to the Roman people, assembles the Comitia Centuriata again, because they can't vote while they're just in one of these informal meetings, and this time they vote for war. So the Roman people are committed, and they send a major commitment to send an army, and supported by a fleet, over to Macedonia. And once again, they will fight most of the war through their allies. They'll rely very heavily on local troops on the ground. So we'll only look at the course of the war fairly briefly, because it's fairly complicated. Again, it's a reminder that the Romans have this naval capacity. They have a fleet, because they've developed it during the Punic Wars. And during the Second Punic War in particular, they've got used to projecting their military force some way afield. So they've sent armies to Spain and supported them. They sent armies to Sicily and supported them. They've sent troops to Macedonia before and supported them. And eventually they've sent them to Africa and they've won the victory there. So the Romans have the capacity to move substantial numbers of troops by sea and land them on a foreign shore and then support them there. Now again, there were complaints at times during the Second Punic War by commanders on the spot that they weren't supported well enough by the central authority, but the difference was then they were fighting on several fronts at the same time, all major campaigns. This time they're able to devote far more attention to Philip. So compared to the First Macedonian War, the Roman military effort in the Second Macedonian War is on a much larger scale. You've also got troops that are more experienced than would have been the case a generation or so ago. Because bear in mind, most of the people who will be recruited as citizens into the Roman army, into your own legions, but also the Latins and other allies who provide troops for the ally, the contingents that serve with them, and alongside and always make up at least 50% of a Roman army and usually more in the field. These are men who've served against Hannibal or served in the Second Punic War simply because of age. Only the very young, who've only just reached maturity in the last year or two, will have avoided that major commitment, because Rome's mobilization has been so great and extensive that pretty much everyone who in any capacity at all was able to serve has done so, at least to some extent, and in many cases they've seen an awful lot of fighting, because the Second Punic War was one of the most intensively waged conflicts of the ancient era. So it's gone on a long time. Being posted almost anywhere meant there was a fair chance you'd be involved in fighting of some sort. You've got people who've fought in big battles, in lots of skirmishes, they've fought in sieges, raids, all of this sort of thing. And that's true at every level of command. So you've got lots of experienced senators and others. Anybody who's reached the age to be eligible for political office will have spent their 10 years of military service at one of the most intensive periods of fighting ever in Roman history. And you were learning fighting against the Carthaginians, who were really good. Hannibal's army in particular, who have run rings around the Romans early on. So you've learned your trade of soldiering in a very, very hard school. So the Roman army is in a position where it's pretty well supplied and equipped, and it's, best of all, that it's simply confident and trained and experienced. There are one particular contingent that's sent to Macedonia in 200, consisted of men who'd survived the Battle of Cannae and then been sent off to campaign in Sicily and subsequently in Africa and denied discharge from the Roman army and are still in service. They're not too pleased by this stage. They're pretty browned off and fed up, but they are exceptionally experienced soldiers. So they may not be the most confident, but they certainly know how to fight. And these are sent off. So this is a reflection. This is a Roman army that is a citizen, conscript, militia force, however you choose to term it, but it isn't a typical one, because it's from a generation of men who have experience of very large scale, very difficult and dangerous warfare. So the troops they send are pretty good. However, they're still relying on the Aetolians and other allies that they form locally to help them actually wage the war. And much of the early conflict, again, is raiding, usually by sea, of coastal strongholds, trying to take the cities that have harbours or access to the sea, trying to take Philip's allies away from him or communities that he's seized. And there's some bit of fighting, but there's a sense of a lack of purpose. The Roman commanders who go there, who presumably have had a lot of experience fighting against Hannibal and his allies in the Punic War, don't quite seem to be able to get a grip of the war. They don't seem to have a killer instinct or a clear idea of how they're going to fight this through to a victorious conclusion. So you get a couple of campaigns. You've got 2 years of fighting with negligible result. The Romans have won some small victories. They've had a few minor defeats. They're not worse off than they were before, but they haven't really achieved very much. They haven't pushed Philip V to a situation where he's willing to make major concessions and show his submission to Rome openly. Make it clear he's happy to be a subordinate ally. He's not going to do anything the Romans don't want. Then in 198, one of the two consuls is a chap called Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Now he is only 30. Now bear in mind, we'll go back, have a look at our chart of the cursus honorum, which we looked at last week. At 30 you should just be eligible to stand for the quaestorship, and you should be 42 before you can stand for the consulship. So this is exceptional, and it's really the last example of the willingness to bend the rules that we'd seen during the Second Punic War, because there was this just desire to have talented individuals, to get the best commanders around. It's also a reflection of the depleted ranks of the aristocracy. The big families have paid a price in blood during the war with Hannibal, particularly in the early years, but also later on. Many of them have died. Many of the promising young sons that would have been celebrated at family funerals as this is the next generation, vote for them, entrust them with major magistracies and commands, they will go off and win victories for the Roman Republic, they're dead. So the Romans have a situation where the Senate's ranks have been filled with a lot more equestrians than usual, men who are very brave, and the main criterion was people who'd served with distinction at lower levels in the war with the Carthaginians, but they don't have the family background, they don't have the connections, they don't have the wealth to push to get to the very top. So competition for the consulship and the praetorship and these things is slightly different at this period. There aren't as many people as usual who are born to the consulship and who are almost bound to win unless they come up against somebody from a similar family and background. And there's also that sense they'd appointed Scipio Africanus, as he'd become, to command the armies in Spain after his father and uncle had been killed, on the basis that it made perfect sense to send another Scipio to Spain, where for a lot of the leaders and a lot of the communities, family name, family identity mattered. Loyalty was more personal than to a sort of abstract, distant Roman Republic. And he's proved to be exceptionally good. And there were others who rose to high office at much younger age. Scipio Africanus breaks all the rules and is truly exceptional because he's only in his 20s, and he goes on to the consulship when he's far too young. He commands, defeats Hannibal and wins the victory. But that's been one of those cases where the Romans will bend the rules because actually this works. And there were some voices raised in protest to this, but on the whole, enough people at all levels, aristocracy and the wider assemblies, and particularly the Comitia Centuriata that will vote people in, has decided to choose exceptional talent over traditional age. And in Scipio's case, he comes from a very well-connected family in the first place. Flamininus, less so. But nevertheless, at 30, he goes out to Macedonia. And has been quaestor, it seems, but he's never been aedile or praetor. So he's jumped those offices. But he's obviously a lot more vigorous, a lot more ambitious, because if he can make it big now, then he's got a lot longer to be an elder statesman, maybe to hold a second consulship, all of these things. So this is someone who's very, very keen for distinction. And a mix of his personal talent and his rather more restless ambition means that he starts to prosecute the war at least a little bit more fiercely, with a bit more determination. There are some advantages as well. He's come there by which time the Romans are learning more about southern Greece, about how to fight here, who's who, what's going on, the routes, this sort of thing. The army has got used to operating in this area. He starts to win some victories. But by the end of his year of office, he starts to negotiate with Philip V. And he starts to offer Philip V fairly generous terms. And this is because he's got one eye cocked over his shoulder on what's happening in Rome. You come into the autumn, late summer, autumn, you'll have the consular elections, so you'll get 2 more consuls for next year, for 197. Macedonia has been up until now the most prestigious war going on, which means that at least, those 2 consuls, they're going to want to have this job. Only one of them can get it, but they're going to be very keen that Macedonia is put down, or the war against Philip of Macedonia is put down as a province for the consuls. So while he thinks that he might well get replaced by somebody else, just as his 2 predecessors have done, because each of them has just had a year of command, again, there's an element where when you're only there for a year, it's quite difficult to fight a war through to a conclusion against a major state. And Macedonia is that. It doesn't have the manpower or the might of Carthage, or even of the Seleucids, but it's still a powerful state, and the terrain in Greece very much restricts where armies can go, where they can fight. So if someone isn't willing to come into open country where you can fight a big battle against a large army, or can be forced into doing that, then it tends towards smaller actions and prolonged fighting rather than a rapid decision. We'll go into this not in this series of lectures, but in some others at some point. When we look at Greek warfare, there's an element of sort of mutual consent amongst the hoplite tradition, where you go out and you want to get it over with, so you fight a battle to sort things out. Different views on that. That's something we'll deal with another time. But Flamininus talks to Philip, and then, as far as he's concerned, there's great news, because war has flared up in Cisalpine Gaul, that area where Gallic tribes live south of the Alps, north of the River Po. And it's such a big war involving Gauls and Ligurians that both consuls are allocated provinces in that area, and both will go with armies to fight there in northern Italy. And Whoopi, as far as Flamininus is concerned, his command is extended, it's prorogued, he becomes a proconsul for the next year at the very least, which means that he's got another bite of the cherry. There's another chance to wage war against Philip and maybe win a real victory. So as soon as he knows that his command is secure, Flamininus breaks off negotiations with Philip V and continues fighting. The war then reaches a head where both sides have mustered a large army. It takes time for Philip to do this. And remember again that, as I've said earlier on, he's got a core of troops that do lots of fighting, but they tend to be his cavalry, his lighter armed troops. When he masses the main phalanx, then a lot of these men are very good, potentially very good soldiers. They are people within that tradition. They will fight very bravely, but they haven't had a lot of chance to practice as a big phalanx operating, and they haven't got much experience of fighting directly large-scale battles. So if anything, although the Romans have been fighting wars, they haven't fought a big battle in this campaign so far. Nevertheless, the Romans are probably in many ways the more experienced, the slightly more subtle and sophisticated army, perhaps a better coordinated team, is the best way of putting it, than the Macedonians at this point. Now, the Romans are also, one of the great ironies of this is that these Roman troops have been in part feeding off grain that's been sent to them by Carthage, doing its duty as a good Roman ally, behaving suitably humbly and supporting the Romans. They've also got some more elephants on their side sent by the Numidian king that had fought with such distinction at Scipio, well, first of all against the Romans and then at Scipio's side and helped him win the Battle of Zama that ended the war. So you have this encounter battle at Cynocephali in 197. And it is quite striking that the two armies are marching in the same area, semi-parallel, but on different sides with lines of hills and mountains in between, and they move towards the Cynocephali Pass, and they bump into each other. You can tell if you look in detail, and we might do that again in another talk, but for the purposes of this series, and the Conquered and the Proud, we can't go into too much detail on individual battles. Essentially, they don't know the other one's there. They are groping in the dark, trying to find each other. And again, it's a reminder of just how ancient armies operate. When the advance guards bump into each other, more troops committed as more come up, and it develops into a battle. It isn't a planned encounter on either side. Now, ancient armies, at least in this era, tend to deploy from a line of march by wheeling to the right. And your order of march is based on where you'll stand in the battle line, so that the nearer you are to the front of the column, the closer you are to the right, and then so on through to the center, and then the left will be the very rear. And you can see this reflected in the way the battle develops, because the two armies rush up, try and deploy. But they don't really all have time to get there. And in each case, as they advance, the right wing of each respective army defeats the other's left wing, because that's what you're facing. Obviously, if you look, Philip's right is over here facing, sorry, that's his left. I'm getting confused now myself. Sorry, the Roman right is over there facing Philip's left. His right is facing the Roman left. Each punches through, and the line collapses, they break through, and it's again a reflection, as I say, the people who have more time to get into position, to form up, to dress ranks, deploy properly, are the ones nearer the front of the column who will form the right of the army towards the centre. So your army, in effect, if you're deploying quickly, is weaker on the left, and the left naturally is facing the right because the Romans have come and deployed that way, and the Carthaginians have come and deployed that way. So their best bit is there, the Romans' best bit is there, so they each hit the weakest part of the other line. So at this stage, things are fairly even. However, it's a sign of the different military systems that an unnamed tribune, one of the 6 officers commanding each Roman legion, is supposed to have drawn off maniples, these units, from the third rank or the third line of the Roman legions and allied troops and moved them over to attack the successful Philip's right wing, his phalanx there, in the flank and in the rear. And this breaks. The Macedonians don't really have a reserve. That's the nature of the pike phalanxes. You tend to deploy it in one line and you might make it very thick or very deep with lots of ranks, but Philip and Alexander had never made much use of reserves, and the same has been true in the successor period, in part because the various leaders feel obliged to fight in the same style as Philip and as Alexander. Few of them push it to the extent of heroic stroke suicidal bravery of Alexander the Great, of steaming out right ahead of everybody, but nevertheless they're expected to do that. It isn't really their job to be committing reserves. But of course, interestingly, it's not Flamininus himself who spots this and commits the Roman reserve troops to win the battle. It's this tribune who, as I say, doesn't even get a name in the source. Polybius doesn't tell us who he is. But the Macedonian army is broken, a lot of people are killed. It's always the most dangerous time in an ancient battle is when the army collapses and runs away, because the enemy then get very, very keen and very, very aggressive. And there's a story that the Macedonians raised their pikes as a mark of surrender, but the Romans didn't understand what this meant, so just were killing people because they thought, well, they're going to make themselves helpless, more fool them. So there may have been cultural misunderstanding, but there is always an element where you suffer very badly, and this is something Hannibal had been good at pursuing, at following up his victories, inflicting as much loss on the Romans as possible. The idea is do as much damage, the enemy isn't going to want to fight you again. Philip V suffers a very serious defeat, and that means his losses are so heavy that he isn't going to be able to form another army quickly. It will take years before he can build up that sort of force again, and he doesn't have anything in the meantime. The loss of prestige is also considerable. So very quickly, he is willing to negotiate for peace and effectively capitulate to the Romans. Flamininus has won his victory well within his second year as in command. Therefore, he's got what he wants. So he's very happy to negotiate a peace settlement with Philip, because one of the greatest glories is to end a war, finish a war on behalf of the Roman people. And so this is what he does, and the peace terms imposed are quite interesting. First of all Greeks in Greece and Asia to be free and governed by their own laws. Greek cities subject to Philip V to be surrendered to Rome. Philip V had to evacuate cities in Asia Minor. All prisoners and deserters, they don't get a prominent role in the Roman sources, but there often are deserters from Roman armies that decided they've had enough. And the Romans are quite keen to catch them. Philip has to give up nearly half of nearly all of his fleet. Again, remember the threat that had been presented to the Roman people. One of the reasons why they're supposedly persuaded to go to war is that Philip has a fleet. He could sail across the Adriatic and be in Italy in just a matter of days. We don't want that. To avoid that, we've got to take him out. Philip V should not wage war outside Macedonia without the Senate's permission. And Philip V paid an indemnity of 1,000 talents, half immediately, the rest in 10 annual installments. So it's a big sum, but it's not an overwhelmingly huge sum. And compared to the 50-year indemnity you've imposed on Carthage, this is big, but it's a reflection perhaps of Macedonia's status and wealth. It's interesting that the freedom of the Greek cities is made very prominent in the treaty. And Flamininus attends the Isthmian Games. Now, we tend to think of the Olympics because, of course, they've been revived in their modern form, but there was a cycle of a 4-year period of the Olympiad. You had Olympics every 4 years, but you have other games that occur that are pan-Hellenic festivals where there's a truce for a while, everybody gathers to compete in athletics and to some extent in artistic competition as well. So this is a time when lots of noble representatives of, the wealthy tend to go most of all to visit these things and take part in them, have arrived to celebrate this game at the Isthmian Games is near the joint between the Peloponnese, the sort of bit where Sparta and Corinth is down there, and mainland Greece, that narrow strip of land or isthmus. So Flamininus goes there and he proclaims this freedom of the Greek cities. It's a fairly vague, it's one of those words that sounds great, but actually doesn't in practical terms necessarily mean very much. But it's very much the rhetoric that has been employed by successive kings of Macedonia, of the Seleucids, of the Ptolemies, of Pergamum, and of elsewhere. The freedom of the Greeks. The idea is that the big states, the big kingdoms shouldn't be interfering, that local communities should be autonomous, they should be able to run their own affairs, they shouldn't be dominated by others, they should be living like proper civilized Greeks because we're all part of this wider Hellenic community that are the most civilized and best people in the world. And that's how we should do things. So the Romans are using the same language, the same boasts. Perhaps, if anything, there's slightly more resonance with them for the Romans, because the one thing the Romans do is they don't stay in Macedonia. Macedonia is not turned into a province. Philip V is still in charge of his kingdom. The Romans do not choose to take any territory. As in the earlier war, most of the plunder has gone to the Aetolians and others, but they do take some back, and they've taken this indemnity. And this is not meant to be a permanent commitment and a military presence and a permanent province for the Roman Republic. We've gone in, we've taken out Philip V, we're going home. Whereas when Macedonia or when Seleucid or anybody else proclaims this, they still have a physical presence nearby and they're still part of that community. But it does mean the Romans have now intruded, pushed themselves deeply into this Hellenic world and the sense that they are participants. And it's almost a statement that we are, we can stand on the same level as you culturally, we can be part of this. And it's an early sign of this love affair that the Roman aristocracy will develop with Greek culture, and much of Roman society will develop with Greek culture in the years to come. And Flamininus dresses like a Greek, there's this great sense of he goes a little bit native by Roman standards, but it's probably good diplomacy from the Greeks' point of view. The thing that you can never change, even though the Romans are not maintaining a physical presence, now that they have intervened in southern Greece and they have defeated and humbled Macedonia far more significantly. There was no victory on this scale in the First Macedonian War. The Romans end it because the Aetolians decide to end it and the Romans can't really prosecute it on their own. This time the Romans have won a clear victory, and a king of Macedonia has admitted publicly, at least by Roman standards, whether he chooses to see it this way himself, that he is subordinate to the Romans and the Roman Republic. And there will be an idea will develop again amongst the Roman aristocracy in the years to come that to be a Roman senator and a Roman magistrate makes you at least the equal of any Hellenic king. There's that sense that we are on that same level because we're so great. So it is an important stage, but because the Romans have intervened, that means that lots of communities know that, well, they've done it before, they might do it again. Having the Romans as a friend is an attractive proposition to many communities. And a lot of the diplomacy in this area works and has worked for centuries, whereby when you have two communities in a dispute, two Greek communities, they will appeal to another community or leader or king as arbitrator. And they sometimes will get involved, or sometimes they'll appoint somebody else again to, basically decide, to judge who's right, who's wrong, and to suggest a solution to this. So you find that lots of people who are less powerful seek the aid, seek the interest of the more powerful. So once you're within this system, Rome is now a viable source of this sort of patronage, this sort of arbitration. So increasingly Greek communities will think, well, it might be worth going to Rome to ask the Romans if they'll intervene. What follows tends not to be initiated by the Romans, but that doesn't mean that they're not choosing then to act on an invitation, to act on an approach. So let's move on briefly. We'll just quickly look at the Roman army at this time because it's useful for our discussion. So we've talked about this a little bit already in the previous talk and the one before. The Roman army consists of Roman citizens who are called up and serve according to their property rating in the census. So again, the most wealthy are eligible to be cavalrymen because they can afford a horse, and they can afford it the time and the energy and the effort and the space to keep a horse and learn how to ride. The bulk of your sort of middling classes, the people who own not huge farms but enough to support themselves, their families, their household, they're partly worked by slaves, partly worked by hired labour, they form the bulk of your heavy infantry. It's sort of the old hoplite class of Greek cities. So you have, most consuls will be given an army of 2 legions and 2 alai. Ally literally means wings because the units of Latin and Italian allies deployed on either side of the 2 legions. Praetor will normally get 1 legion and 1 ala. The size varies of individual contingents, both the legion and the ala. Depends on the situation, it depends on the Senate's perception of the scale of the military problem, but also the influence of the magistrate who's been appointed in some cases. You know, if you're well favoured, you might be able to get more given to you. If people don't like you so much, you might be starved of resources. Legions range in size from 4,200 infantry to 4,200 to 5,000 infantry, 200 to 300 cavalry. These are all figures based on Polybius. And within those you have, first of all, you're up to 300 cavalry. They're drawn from the equestrian century, so those people who vote first in the Comitia Centuriata, 18 centuries of them there. Then you've got the 600 triarii that are the first component of your main 3 lines of heavy infantry. Triarii are the oldest, most experienced men, the veterans. They're at the back. They're your ultimate reserve. There aren't as many of them as there are in the front 2 lines. You've got the principes that are men in the prime of life, late 20s, early 30s, and the hastati in front of them who are younger. You're deployed in maniples. This is a group led by 2 centurions, one of them senior, of 120 to 160-ish men, 10 of those in each line. The triarii are in smaller maniples because there are fewer of them. So the whole Roman deployment, again, it harks back to what we were talking about at Cynocephali, is in 3 lines of heavy infantry. You've got some cavalry, you've got your light infantry that are your poor and your younger citizens not yet old enough to serve in the main battle line, are the velites, the skirmishers, whose main job is to support the other lines, to run through the gaps, go forward, throw some missiles, run back away. They are singled out as being rather more aggressive than many of the light infantry that the Macedonians and Greeks had experienced before. There's a passage in Livy where he talks about the wounds inflicted by the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword that even the light infantry, the velites, have, and how they lopped off limbs and heads and all this sort of thing. Interestingly, he talks all about slashing cuts rather than the stabbing wounds that are most associated with the gladius, particularly in its later form. So you have that, then you have the allies. You've got the command structure overall, so you've got centurion in command of each century. The right-hand century commands the maniples, so there are 20 centuries in each line, 10 maniples. The whole legion is commanded by 6 military tribunes. Now, interestingly, and it's another reflection of this Roman tendency not to give one man supreme power for any length of time. As far as we can see, the tribunes commanded in pairs, and there's a rotation, that a pair is in command either for a day or for longer, then another pair takes over, and so on and so on. So it's that same idea, which isn't always the best thing you would think in a military context. And then we've got the makeup of an ala, which is similar to a legion. They're never as well described. Not as much attention is paid to them in our sources. Their role in battle tends to be minimized. But the impression is that they fight in basically the same way. They're organized in basically the same way as the Romans. They do, however, tend to have a larger cavalry contingent. So that's a significant difference. And they're commanded by prefects, possibly with the same sort of shared command that you have with the tribunes. And they have the extraordinari, get our word extraordinary from it. These are picked men, cavalry and infantry, that are at the army commander's immediate disposal. They camp near his tent, and they're often used as an advance guard, a special force, all this sort of thing. And it's interesting that those are chosen from the allies rather than from the Roman citizen legions. Anyway, we've had the Second Macedonian War. The Romans have won it in 3 years, or slightly over 3 years, three and a bit campaigning seasons. Early on in the fourth, because it doesn't take the whole year for Flamininus to win his victory, because once you fought the battle, that's pretty much it. So it's much shorter than the First Macedonian War, because the Romans have committed more resources and Flamininus has been able to use them well. However, the peace treaty the Romans have extorted from Philip is one that the Romans consider to be appropriate and is approved back home. There's some slight modification, but basically speaking, that's what's established, so that it has less favoured the Aetolians and local allies of that sort who had played the dominant role in the First War, and who, when they decided to make peace with Philip, forced the Romans to do the same. So the Aetolians have seen the Romans come onto their turf, and instead of feeling that Philip's been humbled and therefore now the Aetolian League is more important, plenty of people are thinking, well, actually this time it's the Romans who've won. The Romans are more important. And again, the Adriatic's not that wide. If we want to seek some help, if we want to seek someone to arbitrate in disputes between us, maybe we should go to Rome. So the Aetolians feel left out. They haven't got as much as they wanted and expected and felt was their right from assisting the Romans to fight Philip V. Because they wanted back all the territory Philip had taken from them, and they don't get it all. They get some of it, but not all. Now in 193, the Aetolians again seek help from outside. In the past, they've been willing to go to the Romans. Now they go to Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, and they ask him to liberate Greece. Again, it's the same rhetoric of come and free the Greeks. We used to be dominated by Philip V, now we're dominated by the Romans. Okay, they've gone away, but their influence is still here. Now, Antiochus, his aims aren't too clear. He might well be thinking, he decides to intervene in Greece, but he might just be thinking, well, if I put on a show of force, the Romans are now a factor in my world. Like it or not, they've arrived in the Hellenic world. They haven't stayed in southern Greece, but they could come back. You know, you don't need to physically occupy to be involved. And they've humiliated Macedonia. Now, I don't like Philip V. I'm glad he's been beaten, but I don't want the Romans to get ideas. So probably Antiochus is looking at getting the Romans to accept and respect him, to show that he is strong and therefore worth being a friend. It's a fairly standard way of thinking about diplomacy and international relations in the ancient world. Again, emphasizing this fact, I am powerful, therefore, let's be friends. We can do this as equals. You can recognize me, I'll recognize you. We'll make it very clear this is a line neither of us crosses. That's fine. So he sends an expedition, but the Achaeans, it's another one of these leagues, they declare war on him. And although the Seleucid expedition isn't that large, it's a smaller army than Philip V had at Cynocephalae, the Romans respond, and the consul Marcus Acilius Glabrio lands in Greece with 22,000 men. So a fairly standard consular army, 2 legions plus ally. And he defeats Antiochus the Great and his Seleucids at Thermopylae. And it's one of the many occasions in history where the pass and passes at Thermopylae have become critical ground, because it is one of those few natural routes through very mountainous Greece. But the same thing happens as it happened to Leonidas and the Spartans and the other Greek allies there when they were facing the Persians in 480 BC. The Romans have read their history books. In one source, it's the elder Cato who grabs a local and persuades him to show them the route around. They outflank the position which the Seleucids have fortified. The Seleucids seem to have forgotten their history, and the Romans seem to have learnt from history. But the Romans outflank and they destroy Antiochus' army, so his expedition is defeated. And round about the same time, the navy, the Seleucid navy, is defeated by a fleet of the Romans with their allies from Pergamum, and at Cape Corycus. They are defeated. The Aetolians last a bit longer. They last until 189, and the Romans still have to overcome them. But basically, the Seleucid expedition to Greece is over, and it doesn't look like anything's going to happen anytime soon. They've defeated at land, they're defeated by sea. The Romans have confirmed alliance with Pergamum, that they've been allied with before in both the wars against Macedonia. The Aetolians they've lost as allies, but they also defeat, and the Achaeans have now become an important ally, at least for the moment, because they didn't fancy the Seleucid involvement. But that isn't enough for the Romans, and this leads to the Roman army first crossing into Asia. And in Lucius Cornelius Scipio is elected consul for 190, and he's allotted the war in Greece, but permitted to cross into Asia Minor. So he will do that. Now, it's interesting, he's given this command partly because his brother, Scipio Africanus, says, well, you know, who's still a young man, that he'll go with him. He'll go on his staff, he will accompany him and, you know, make sure that he gets things right. Now, by another irony, Hannibal, who had scared the Romans so much, inflicted such losses on them in the Second Punic War, after going back to Carthage, after helping to get his home country back on its feet again, putting them into a position where their economy had recovered, they could start to repay the war debt that the Romans had imposed upon them. So Hannibal, after fleeing from Carthage, has ended up at the court of Antiochus, seeking service effectively as a sort of mercenary commander. Now, obviously, he has a great reputation, which is good in some respects, but means that in the politics of a court, you might also be viewed with suspicion and viewed as a potential rival. He is employed by Antiochus, but he isn't given a land command, he's given a naval command, which doesn't go quite so well. Might be lack of experience, might be other factors, resources, the situation, all of this sort of thing. The best in the world can't necessarily win all the time. But because the Romans know he's there, there's an extra appeal for sending Scipio Africanus, even if he's, you know, backing up his younger brother, even if he's behind the scenes, as your someone to make sure that if we've got to meet Hannibal, we've got the man who beat him on the spot. Now, in fact, in the campaign that follows, Scipio Africanus isn't present at the decisive encounter. Various reasons for this. There's an element of scandal, there's some prisoners taking within the family that involves them, and also there may have been a deliberate, well, I'll step back so my brother can get the glory this time, rather than the victory being attributed to me. But in 190 BC, at the Battle of Magnesia, Antiochus III brings a very large army to fight a Roman consular army backed by allies from Pergamum and elsewhere, so a substantial force in a hard-fought battle that again the Romans win. And once again, we don't really have a huge amount of time to go into detail in this, but Antiochus will deploy war elephants against the Romans, he will deploy cataphracts and a very large and deep pike phalanx, as well as other good cavalry. There is a breakthrough. Part of the Roman line seems to collapse and be broken through, but again, it's a situation where the Romans have this successive line of reserves that allow them to cope with this more easily than a Macedonian-style army that doesn't. Once it's broken through in one place, that tends to be it. And also the Roman allies play a very significant part. So Antiochus III is beaten, Lucius Scipio wins his victory, and the war is brought to a conclusion. Very late on, a new consul had been allocated to the province, was on his way out, but arrives too late. Antiochus has already negotiated and made peace. Now, this peace treaty is slightly different. It's modified by the Senate, but eventually the terms of it are as follows. Antiochus was to withdraw beyond the Taurus Mountains. That's the sort of the bend, really, between Asia Minor and the coast going down, the Syrian coast going down there. It's the area where, well, in later periods, Cilicia will end, and Tarsus, the city of St. Paul, that's in that area. So you've got the mountain range there. So it means that Asia Minor itself, that promontory, that large wide promontory, modern day Turkey, I suppose, roughly, remains outside the influence of the Seleucid king, which means kingdoms like Pergamum, your allies, benefit greatly from this. So that's a good clause for them. indemnity of 15,000 talents. That's big. That's a reflection of just how wealthy the Seleucids are, because Carthage only paid 10,000. I mean, it's far, far more than Macedonia. So again, it shows the relative might, but also the sense of threat and that needs to be made up. Payment to Pergamum of debt of 400 talents plus grain. So Pergamum gets an extra benefit there. Hannibal is to be surrendered, and named Greek agitators, so people who've invited the Seleucids into Greece that caused all this war in the first place, as far as the Romans are concerned. Antiochus is not to make war in Europe or in the Aegean Sea, and he's only to fight defensively if attacked by nations there, but not allowed to conquer or make them allies. Rome to arbitrate in this dispute. So again, it's putting Rome on a higher level than the others. It's making clear, yes, you might be head of this big empire, but we have defeated you and we're the Romans. The Roman Republic is more powerful than you. At least that's how the Romans would like to see it. So it's establishing this pecking order. And all your war elephants to be surrendered and most of your fleet to Rome. So you're crippled as a naval power, which again will limit your capacity to do things in the Aegean, but also, and it's quite significant, the war elephants seem to have made more of an impression on the Romans in this conflict than they had in the Punic War, though of course Hannibal and his elephants are famous. They didn't really achieve that much in the battles. Hannibal wins his victories primarily through other means, and for most of his campaigns he doesn't even have any elephants in Italy. But these elephants are to be handed over to the Romans or killed. And later, decades later, a Roman embassy that visits the court of Antiochus will insist upon the hamstringing, the crippling of the elephants that the Seleucids have acquired in the meantime. So this is another Roman statement of Roman power, Roman superiority that the Hellenic kingdoms are expected to accept, and that basically they don't have much choice but to accept because Antiochus is not really in a position to fight another war. Now, again, this is because he does control this very, very large, extensive empire, and he's usually got problems elsewhere. Apart from rivalry with the Ptolemies in particular, because he's got a land border with them, whereas he doesn't have one with Philip V of Macedon anymore. But also, he's got nomads from the steppes to the north and northeast. He's got Indian powers on the eastern borders. Antiochus has lots of other problems to keep him very busy, and he doesn't want to wage a life or death struggle with Rome. And probably, if we're right in thinking that he's only gone to war with them or only intervened in Greece in the first place to get respect from the Romans, then clearly that's gone badly wrong. But there's nothing really to his advantage to fighting a prolonged conflict with the Romans. It doesn't do him any good. The Romans are too far away, and he's suffered with this, but he has to think like any king of this era, well, okay, I've lost, but let's build up my power again, and then later on we can see, maybe I can start to creep back to some of the territories where I've lost influence. One interesting thing about this conflict is that just as the Carthaginians have sent food to supply the Roman army fighting against Philip V of Macedon, Philip V has helped the Romans in their war against Antiochus III. That's partly because he doesn't like him, but it's also he's doing what a Roman ally is expected to do. So he's supplied food, he's supplied aid, he's helped the Roman army as he's marched through Macedonia to get to the Dardanelles to cross to Asia Minor. And when they go back as well with all their plunder. So, once again, though, yes, the Romans get money, yes, they get prestige, yes, their reputation is greatly enhanced. So there's an even wider area now where communities are likely to think of the Romans as a very useful ally, someone you might want to appeal to when there's an issue, you might want to ask them to act as arbitrator, all this sort of thing. More important to pay attention to them than it is to Antiochus, and maybe we can use the Romans, if we get friendly and chummy with them, then maybe that will help us if we have a dispute, if there's any conflict with Antiochus. Because again, the Romans are to act as arbitrators. But the Romans are once again not establishing a permanent presence. They haven't established one in Greece. They're certainly not keen on establishing anything, creating a permanent province here in the east for even longer. So they go home. There will be a campaign we'll talk about more next time, the time after, where the successor to Lucius Scipio tries to find a war to fight, basically, because he wants glory, he wants a triumph. But in fact, it's Scipio who's won the war. He's got the credit for ending the war with Antiochus, being the first Roman to defeat the Seleucids in a whole war and in a major battle. But somebody else has beaten them at Thermopylae, but this is even bigger. So it's a grander triumph. He comes back with vast amounts of money, far more spectacular. The Eastern kingdoms are very quickly develop this image of being fabulously wealthy, luxuriant, rather decadent, but this is the place to go if you want plunder, the best sort of the wealthiest plunder. So that means that Lucius Scipio goes home with this great reputation, and it enhances the family. However, it's not quite as simple as that. Going back to things we talked about last time, about this constant reassessment of the pecking order, reassessment of individual status, of what your auctoritas was, how much you mattered within the state. In time, the Scipio brothers are seen to be vulnerable, and they come under attack with accusations of peculation and abuses within the finances of fighting this war against Antiochus III, and they're brought to trial on a number of charges. So although Scipio Africanus has defeated Hannibal, won the Second Punic War, perhaps because he spent most of his youth not in the day-to-day politics of the Senate, but out fighting wars and winning battles, he's less skillful as a politician. And he ends up rather bitter. And there's some dispute with this passage from Livy about he's brought to trial or he's accused, and things happen, but there's some interesting stories from what happens during the trial. Because again, even being brought to trial and accused of abusing funds, of doing things you shouldn't do, damages your auctoritas. The fact that people consider you vulnerable, that you're not so powerful, so influential, you don't have such a reputation that no one would be daft enough to try and take you to court because they know that the rest of the aristocracy is going to close ranks and turn against you. They don't want to upset these people. Someone realizes you can upset the Scipios and get away with it. They are vulnerable. But again, when he appears as the defendant, if you look at the quote up on the screen, no other man before him, not even Scipio himself, when he was consul or censor, is ever escorted to the forum by a greater crowd of people of every class on the day he appears in court. When bidden to make his defense, he does something very interesting. He, instead of talking about the charges involved, he embarked on a speech about his achievements, without any reference to the charges against him, in so lofty a strain that it was generally admitted that no one had ever been praised more splendidly or more truthfully. After all, he has done a lot for Rome. For he described those achievements in the same spirit and with the same ability that he had shown in their performance. And there was no distaste in his hearers, because the purpose of the narrative was not self-glorification, but self-defense. The trial continued till nightfall and was adjourned to a later day. Again, like any public event at Rome, it stops when the sun sets. When the appointed day came, the tribunes took their seats on the rostra at daybreak. The defendant was summoned, and he came through the midst of the assembled crowd with a great following of friends and dependents. He reached the rostra, and when silence fell, he spoke in these words: "Tribunes of the plebs and citizens of Rome, this is the day on which I fought with good success in a pitched battle against Hannibal and the Carthaginians in Africa. Therefore, since it is proper on this day that lawsuits and quarrels should be set aside, I shall straightway go from here to the capital, to offer salutation to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, to Juno, to Minerva, and to the other gods who preside over the capital and the citadel. I also invite you, citizens of Rome, all of you for whom it is convenient, to come with me and pray to the gods that you may have leaders like me. But I invite on this assumption that if from my 17th year up to my old age you have always been in advance of my years in promoting me to posts of honour, I, on my part, have anticipated those honours of yours by my achievements." The fathers with a... next bit. So it's quite interesting. You have somebody basically going into court and saying, look, this is the anniversary of the Battle of Zama. Isn't it great? Aren't I great? Look at all the honours you've given to me. He's not defending himself, because defending himself would show that he had something, there was some guilty secret. There was some cause for concern. So he adopts this stance of just reminding, look at all the things I've done for you. I've turned things around in the Second Punic War. I was the man who chucked the Carthaginians out of Spain, invaded Africa, drew Hannibal home and defeated him and ended the war. And since then I've been censor, I've been consul, I've helped my brother defeat Antiochus. We won that war, we beat Antiochus, all of this sort of thing. I am Scipio Africanus, honour me, show me suitable respect. I'm not demeaning myself by answering these petty charges. However, although he doesn't get condemned, Scipio plays no significant role in politics after that. He dies fairly young, he seems embittered, he has a sense of being rejected. But it's a reminder that even though you can win spectacular glory and wealth in military campaigns, it doesn't guarantee you a place at the top of Roman politics all the way through. You've still got to do other things. You've got to influence enough people, and you've got to be concerned with the day-to-day exchanging of favours and friendships and doing deals within the Senate and being prominent, doing deals with people from the rest of society as well, or on their behalf. So it's an interesting reminder that whilst we see the great glory of the conquerors and the victorious generals, it isn't inevitable that having done that guarantees them a place and a prominence for the rest of their lives. So it shows again the dynamism and the intense competition of Roman political life. So, the Romans have fought their wars, they've turned the Macedonians and the Seleucids into subordinate allies, and Roman power, Roman imperium, Roman reputation has increased tremendously. They're involved with far more communities than they've ever been directly involved with before. The Ptolemies, they never fight. The Ptolemies are old friends. They were sending the Romans grain during the Punic Wars, and they were the earliest ally in the area. The Ptolemies seem to have reached out to the Roman Republic. So the Ptolemies never fight the Romans. Not directly anyway, or at least you can depict it as there are factions within them who will fight when they're rebellion, but they're not really legitimate Ptolemies. But the recognized kings are always loyal allies of Rome. Macedonia has not done that. It's attacked the Romans go back and they hammer it until it becomes a subordinate ally. The Seleucids are now in the same boat. But the Romans, although they haven't established a physical permanent presence in Greece or in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're still now part of the power struggles, the competition, the ongoing diplomacy, international relations in that area. And also there is this tendency that when you fought somebody once, you still are very wary of them, you still see them as a potential enemy if the opportunity offers. So in the same way they've gone and fought the Second Macedonian War, in part because Philip's already an enemy. Philip V that attacked them during the war with Hannibal, they fought the First Macedonian War. The outcome of that was not satisfactory. It didn't humble him to any degree. Therefore, we need to make sure that he knows his place and he will be frightened of us and he will respect us. Again, this is something we'll talk about more when we look at the reasons for imperialism and how it actually plays out and how it works, what the dynamics are. But there is peace then for a while, and eventually Philip V dies, is succeeded by his son Perseus. Now, in 172 BC, the Romans consider Perseus to be a threat and they declare war on him, and we have what we know as the Third Macedonian War that lasts for 5 years. So here is the decree. It's the fathers, with a prayer for a blessing on this undertaking by the Roman people, directed the consuls to present to the Comitia Centuriata on the first possible day the following motion. Whereas Perseus, in breach of the treaty made with his father Philip and renewed with himself after his father's death, has attacked allies of the Roman people, had ravaged their lands and captured their cities, and whereas he has embarked upon designs for preparing war against the Roman people, has assembled arms, soldiers, and a fleet, it is hereby resolved that unless he puts matters right, war against him is to be undertaken. This time the Comitia Centuriata is happy to vote this through. But again, it shows the perception of someone who has been an enemy in the past, or the son of a king, he's a king who's fought you, now his power is growing. He's looking dangerous. Bear in mind the 10-year indemnity has long since been paid off by this, so Macedonia is no longer reminded of its submissive status by paying Rome every year. Perseus has done what any king would naturally do. He's tried to build up his own strength, his power, he's built up his army, his navy, he's campaigned to increase his influence amongst the peoples on his border. He's hired a group called the Bastani that are singled out for particular attention in the Roman sources. We next really hear of them to any great degree later on in the later 1st century, 2nd century with the struggle with the Dacian king Decebalus. And they might be some of the people depicted on the Adam Clissi monument you can see from this picture, where Tacitus describes them as being partly Germanic, and you've got people on this monument with the Swabian knot, the hair tied in a knot on the side or top of the head. That's a particular style of the Germanic tribes, especially the Swabi. So it might be these, but bear in mind we're jumping on best part of 3 centuries to get to that. So whether the Bastani are quite the same Bastani and whether they still look like that or they looked like that in Perseus's day is a moot point. But this is declared as a just war. And again, the Roman concept of the bellum justum, the just war, is something we will talk about in much more detail next time when we investigate imperialism as a theme. But the Romans are saying they are fighting this war to protect their allies, their friends, their good, loyal allies who've been attacked by Perseus. So again, Perseus is given a choice: set things right, behave properly, give back the things you've taken from our allies, and then we won't fight you. But you've got to know your place. And because he doesn't do any of this, or doesn't do it quickly enough or satisfactorily enough from the Roman point of view, the Romans send another army to Macedonia. But again, this is after a couple of decades. So it's, or best part of that anyway, it's not an instant thing. It's a new generation, and it is quite striking that by this time, by 172, the Roman army that will go to fight the Macedonians isn't quite the same Roman army as the one that had gone to fight Philip V, because it no longer consists of Punic War veterans, largely because they're just too old. You haven't got a mass of people at all ranks, the majority of whom have come through that experience of the Second Punic War and have the confidence of victory, but also have learned all the hard lessons of repeated defeats. This is less experienced, a different Roman army. The early stages of this war don't go terribly well for the Romans. But it is similar. Polybius claims that Perseus has an army of 44,000 men. He's involved himself more and more in Greek affairs. He's supported factions within the cities there. Now, often he's presented as supporting democratic groups in particular. Probably what this usually means is that you support the people who are not in power at the time, because they're the ones most likely to be looking for aid from elsewhere. They'd like to dominate in their own city, therefore they look for somebody big and strong to help them. So it might well be coincidence rather than any particular ideological approach, but that's, anyway, an element within it. It's basically he's opposing the groups in power, or at least he's supporting the groups who oppose the ones in power. The ones in power are in the main ones fairly friendly to the Romans, because the Romans have, they're a friend worth having. But he is presented as a threat to Rome. And there is emphasis on the sources, particularly later on the tradition you get in Livy, but to some extent in Polybius as well, that it's the old threat of an army that might arrive in Italy. They talk about he's built up the fleet. Well, that means he can sail across the Adriatic. And there's talk with the Bastani and others, it's pushing him further and further along towards the Danube and that area, that he might try and get to Italy by land, because after all, Hannibal has. So there is that worry. It seems unlikely that Perseus really was a major threat to the Roman Republic to that degree. For all the newfound strength of his army and the recovery from the losses that Philip had suffered in his defeat. Macedonia has had time to build up its strength again. And for Perseus's early successes in his operations elsewhere. That doesn't necessarily mean that plenty of Romans wouldn't see him as a real threat. Because again, yes, the Punic War generation is no longer quite so active. Aemilius Paulus, who ends up finishing this war, is the son of the man who was killed at Cannae. Most of them are too old to fight. They are some of your senior officers, but other than that, there's not many left. But it's still in living memory. People still know what it was like to have the terror of Hannibal in Italy. And there is that feeling that, we've really got to do this. Otherwise, if we don't stand up to him, he will get stronger and stronger, and maybe he will be a threat. So I don't think we can discount all of those, but there is also an element where he's not behaving as a subordinate ally should. We've beaten Macedonia in the past, they should know their place, they should act in a suitably humble way. They're not doing that, therefore the Romans declare war. It's similar to the Second Macedonian War in its course, in that early on it's fairly tentative fighting, a lot of raiding, and again often by sea. A lot of these coastal communities are the most vulnerable. And the early commanders are criticised for not really doing very well, not knowing what they're doing, not being sufficiently aggressive. There's always the network, if you're dealing with lots of local allies, local communities, the sensibilities. The politics of Greece are fairly complicated at any time because you have so many different leagues and communities and factions within them. So learning how to deal with that can take time, and it does, the Romans are probably learning. Their army probably does have a lot more to learn now because it's not composed of quite so many true veterans at all levels, and you don't have so many veteran officers to train them either. So it's a different situation, but nevertheless things start to improve. Aemilius Paulus, say the son of the man who died at Cannae, is given a second consulship. So he is an experienced commander. He's commanded in the field before, and he comes in, like a lot of Roman commanders, the stereotype is, imposes discipline on the army, trains them properly, gets them going again. Within a short time, it culminates in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, where, again, it's a battle that happens accidentally. There is bickering between the outposts, the two armies are camped near each other, and this escalates as more and more troops from the pickets are brought, and their supports are drawn into the fighting. Both armies end up deploying. The Macedonians then decide, oh, what the hell, and go and advance to attack the main Roman army. There's a nice quote in Plutarch. Aemilius Paulus describes the Macedonian phalanx approach, the most terrifying thing he's ever seen in his life. It is a big, hard-fought battle, but you have the flexibility of the Roman legion is on display again, because they have great trouble breaking through the phalanx, but the phalanx starts to split up a little bit because of the nature of the ground. These are maybe Alexander's men, Philip's men could have advanced across, slightly iffy terrain without breaking up, although even those phalanxes do break up at Issus and elsewhere. Large armies will do. It's very hard to march perfectly straight and keep immaculate formation, even across a bowling green or a well-trodden parade ground, and these battlefields are not as neat and tidy as that. But the Romans are able to exploit these breaks in line. They start to work their way into the phalanx, break it up. Up close, the pikemen are vulnerable. So from a stalemate, the battle is over within an hour, which is considered to be unusually fast, and results in a large-scale massacre of many of the Macedonian troops, because when the phalanx breaks up again, they're highly vulnerable. So the Romans win, and Perseus is forced to sue for peace because, again, like his father, he's lost one army, he simply can't replace it. The Romans, when they were defeated by Hannibal, could call up more men because they have such a larger citizen body. But Macedonian armies, like all the successor armies, are drawn from restricted groups within society. And these are a limited pool. And you've not extended your citizenship to everybody in quite the same way. Macedonia itself just doesn't have the manpower, but someone like the Seleucids still only has certain sections of the population that can be recruited and used in the phalanx. And even then, when you've recruited them, you've got to train them. So you've got lots of men obliged to serve because of the deal they have with holding royal land, and you have some professionals, semi-professionals, but it's a limited resource, and if it takes heavy losses, you simply can't replace it. So, this then has ended with a treaty. Provisions were as follows. First thing is that the kingdom goes. So, first of all, the Macedonians were to be free, keeping their own cities and territories, enjoying their own laws, electing annual magistrates. They were to pay the Roman people half the tax they paid to their kings. In the next place, Macedonia was to be divided into 4 districts. So instead of a king, an Antigonid king in Macedonia, Perseus will be the end of the line and the kingdom has gone. Macedonia, instead of being one state, is broken up into 4 regional governments. and these are independent, these are supposed to be autonomous. But they are free, that's what the Romans are claiming, so they're not subject to a king, and they're not subject to direct Roman administration. Now, there is, again, no Roman province created as a result of this war. The Romans may have won, but they're not establishing a permanent, boots-on-the-ground presence in Greece or Macedonia. Further provisions, including a prohibition on the mining of silver and gold, iron and copper mining was allowed, subject to a Roman levy equal to half that paid in the past to Macedonian crowns. They're trying to present it as this is a better deal for the communities. The announcement of these provisions on the first day of the meeting aroused mixed feelings. The unexpected granting of freedom and the lightening of annual tax raised men's spirits, but to those whose commercial activities were interrupted by the division into districts, their country seemed cut in pieces. So unaware were the Macedonians themselves of the size of Macedonia, of the ease with which it could be divided, of the self-sufficiency of each part. So that's a Roman with hindsight. And actually, these four regions, these emereged as they're called, they do survive in administration when much later it does actually become a Roman province. And if you look at the book of Acts, Paul is arrested by officials from one of these four regions that's been established there in the 2nd century BC. So it's still going as a significant administrative unit 200 years later. But again, it's that similar pattern. The Romans have gone in, defeated their enemy, imposed terms that make it clear that Rome is the boss, but they're not staying. They are not occupying. They go away again afterwards. However, there are some severe punishment for some of the communities that have opposed the Romans. One of the most startling and brutal is where Paulus wants to reward his troops and allows them to sack Epirus, the kingdom of Epirus off to the west of Macedonia, that's produced King Pyrrhus, who fought the Romans in the 3rd century BC. Supposedly 150,000 people are enslaved in this operation. Now, we'll talk about this more next time, but sometimes this might simply mean these people are effectively arrested by the Romans, and then if they have family or anybody else who's willing to buy them back, buy their freedom, they'll be released. So they might not necessarily all be shipped off to toil on Roman estates or sold off on the market or whatever it might be. But it's still a huge number of human beings are enslaved in a very short time. And that, again, is a theme that we'll need to discuss in much more detail, the impact of mass enslavements like this, but also the continual flow of slaves from Roman wars overseas, and how this not only devastates the communities these people have come from, but also how it impacts the Romans and the Italian economy. But on his return to Rome, Paulus celebrates a great triumph. Now, we already talked about this a bit in the earlier last week. I think we've quoted from this before, but have we got that still? Yes, there we go. It's about the scale of the possession of 120 million sesterces, considerably larger sum with all the calculating the number of wagons, the weight of the gold and silver under various headings. Paulus himself at last appeared in his chariot. He made an impressive figure. His advanced age, about 60 odd by this stage, merely serving to increase the general dignity of his bearing. After the chariot came his two sons, Quintus Maximus and Publius Scipio, among other distinguished men. Then followed the cavalry by troop, the cohorts of infantry in that order. Each infantryman received 100 denarii, each centurion twice that sum, and each cavalryman 3 times as much. Believed that Paulus would have given twice as much to his infantry, the rest in proportion, if they'd supported his triumph in the voting, or had contentedly applauded the announcement of the sum which was actually given. There's been friction within the army. A tribune by the name of Sulpicius Galba has been one of the leaders of this, where they felt that Paulus wasn't giving them enough loot, not enough reward, not enough praise. There was dissatisfaction. They thought they'd go off, win this war, come back rich. They didn't feel they were quite rich enough. So again, it's a reminder that even these big successes, these spectacular triumphs, not everyone is necessarily happy, and people are trying to cut you down to size. So you have to win really, really big, and then use the wealth and the influence that gives you skillfully to remain at the top of Roman politics. But it is the most lavish triumph that's ever been celebrated in Rome up to this point. And that's been the case with the earlier wars when people have come back from defeating Philip V and then particularly for defeating the Seleucids. Wars in the Eastern Mediterranean are seen as the most profitable. They bring back the most spectacular rewards because you're dealing with a culture that you admire and has all these great artworks, all this gold, and it's just wealthier in a movable, presentable form. Now, while this has been going on, it's interesting that the Romans have adopted a very bullish approach to their diplomacy with the other powers. Now, while the Third Macedonian War has been happening, the Seleucids have decided to intervene in Egypt. The Ptolemy at the time is just an infant, so he's weak. The guardians trying to look after him are vulnerable. The Seleucids move in and try and dictate terms, try to increase their influence in relation to the Ptolemies, both in terms of land, but also they're trying to control, really, make the Ptolemy a puppet king. Now, the Romans have this long-standing alliance with the Ptolemies, but also, apart from that, yes, they're protecting a friend, but also they don't want the Seleucids to get any stronger again. You know, they're wary of this because just like they've just fought a war against the Macedonians, they felt that Perseus has become too strong, too independently minded, might start to have ambition, might start to want to challenge Rome, and we do not want that to happen. But the Romans don't send an army. Instead, they send a delegation, a board of 3, as is very often the case, of senators chosen, led by Gaius Popilius Linas, who'd been consul in 172. And they're sent to Alexandria, that is currently occupied by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. Now, the Seleucids have got an army on the spot. They've occupied Ptolemaic Egypt. They're doing rather well. However, by the time Linus meets him, he's heard about Pydna, so he knows that Perseus has been defeated. That probably makes him even more bullish than he might have been otherwise, but nevertheless, this is still a remarkable behavior from a Roman politician, because he goes up to Antiochus, who very courteously rises to meet him, offers his hand to be shaken rather. Instead of taking his hand, Linus hands him a scroll with a list of demands the Romans are making of the Seleucids. You know, these are our terms. Antiochus is rather shocked. This is extraordinary bad manners apart from anything else, and says, well, look, I can't just give you an answer straight away. That's surely you must know that's not how diplomacy works. I need to go and consult with my advisors. Let me have a think, and we'll let you know our response to your suggestions, your proposals. Let's talk about this. Let's do all this courteously and properly. However, Popilius Linas is having none of that. At this, in keeping with his general acerbity of temper, drew a circle around the king with the rod, the staff he was carried in his hand, and said, before you move out of this circle, give me an answer to report to the Senate. So basically, he's drawn a circle around the king of one of the largest empires in the world and told him, I want an answer now. Before you step out of that, you're going to tell me what your response is. The king hesitated for a moment, astounded by the violence of the command, and he replied, I shall do what the Senate decrees. Not until then did Popilius hold out his hand to the king as an ally and a friend, and then they shake hands. But this is a sign, this is incredible arrogance, and it becomes a famous incident, so the story might be exaggerated, but it gives us an idea of the bullish confidence of the Romans, which again is something we need to think about when we're talking about imperialism next time. But let's just finish with the last Macedonian War. Because, where are we? Yeah. This breaks out in 149 BC, and it's almost a creation of the Romans, because they've turned Macedonia from one kingdom with a reasonably large army into 4 regional governments, each of which responsible for their own defense. And one of the problems that successive Macedonian kings have known over the centuries is that there are lots of fairly hostile people and leaders in Thrace, amongst the Illyrians, that are on your borders. So living in Macedonia, particularly in the border areas, is a dangerous thing. There are raiders out there, and it's very hard for these 4 separate groups to manage their own defense. An invasion is led by a chap called Andriscus, a pretender to the throne. He claims to be the son of Perseus. Who knows whether he was an illegitimate son, who knows. His army is mostly Thracians, and he defeats the militia of the first region he goes into. The Romans hear about this. They send a praetor, not a consul, but a praetor, probably with a standard 1 legion, 1 ala army, and he gets defeated as well. For the first time in all the Macedonian wars, the Macedonians defeat the Romans in a major pitched battle. The Macedonians, again, it's largely a Thracian army, but some volunteers have gathered to Andriscus by this time. So he's really doing the Bonnie Prince Charlie stuff. He's come back, he's smashed the first army to come against him, then the second proper Roman army that's come against him. Other Greek cities see this as a sign, well, maybe the Romans aren't what they used to be in terms of power, and they are really arrogant. We don't necessarily like them, and we certainly don't want to get caught on the wrong side. Maybe Andriscus is going to win. So war breaks out, others declare against the Romans, but eventually they send a proper army under a more capable commander, and Andriscus is defeated. And in 146, this leads to reprisals against other cities, notably the destruction and sack of Corinth, which the Romans strip of large amounts of high-quality art and other things that go back to Italy to decorate villas and public spaces. And in the same year, something we'll talk about another time, they destroy Carthage as well. Carthage is sacked. Carthage is destroyed as a political entity. It ceases to exist, and we'll talk about why they do that next time. But this coincidence, this is the sign. These are what the events of 146 will be what convinces Polybius to write his universal history, to explain how the Romans have become so dominant. Just how is it that these barbarians from Italy are now dominating the Mediterranean world? And it's happened because of the Roman neglect, really. It's only at this point in 146 the Romans finally decide that they will maintain a presence in Greece, and they establish a province of Macedonia because they realize that the Macedonian regions can't protect themselves from external threats in general, let alone when somebody like Andriscus appears who's got charisma, got some talent, got a claim to the throne. So a Roman garrison with a governor is sent there with usually at least a legion, sometimes more. It now adds to the list of Roman provinces, just as Africa will be added after the destruction of Carthage. So the Roman commitments increase, the number of overseas provinces increase, and that means they've got to provide even more magistrates, even more troops every year as garrisons, which starts to impose strains on their system. But usually it's a praetor and 1 legion in Macedonia. It's established in 148, so it's during the war and it just stays there, basically. The 4 regions still exist, so they're still used for much administration, and when we come to look at provincial administration in more detail later, we'll see how far the Romans tried to get the locals to run their own affairs. Even having a Roman province in your region doesn't necessarily mean that the Romans want to do very much. They'd much prefer you to run your own affairs and then sort of just be a higher level of arbitration, supervision, and ensuring that Roman control continues. So the primary purpose of the garrison is frontier defense, but also let's make sure there isn't another Andriscus. Macedonia doesn't rebel. And in the 130s, probably anyway, you've got the Via Ignatia, this road built from Epidamnus near Dyrrhachium on the west coast to the Dardanelles in the east. So they put a road right the way across, a good road they can use in all weathers ideally. It means they're starting to think of imperial security, but also, what might we have to do elsewhere? Where are we going to need to send armies? But also it's to allow you to deal better with threats to the frontier of Macedonia, because if you're going to keep this province, then you have to do a better job of protecting people than the regions you established and then have replaced as the supreme authority in the area. You have to do better than them. So that's the story of the major wars between the Romans and the Macedonians in particular. They fight 4 times, the Seleucids, and they fight just the once in this era. And it's that creeping commitment. The Romans get more and more involved further and further east, and they do this for various reasons, which we'll discuss next time. And there are trends, there are driving forces behind it that need to be thought about and examined and explained, because none of this seems to have been inevitable from the very start back in 200, where they're exhausted and yet they still find the time and the effort, and they're persuaded, in spite of some reluctance, that we've got to go and defeat Philip V of Macedon. So the Romans have done this, they've involved themselves in the east, they've raised these victory monuments, and ironically enough, you have the Aemilius Paulus monument at Delphi in Greece, survives in a fairly fragmentary state, and there is a theory that it was originally commissioned by Perseus to celebrate his victory, but of course when things went the other way, Paulus took it over and modified it a bit so it looked more Roman. It's difficult. Some of the soldiers you can see, even though they're heavily eroded, look more Roman than others. Others look more like Greek cavalrymen. But again, you've got always the allies involved in any of these conflicts who might well want to be presenting themselves to the home market. And you've also got local sculptors who are used to showing things in a certain way. So the Romans have ended up with a permanent province in Macedonia that will last, well, effectively through the rest of the existence of the Roman Empire. So it is a major change, but it's happened gradually. They have not been that keen. They have only fought wars where they perceived a threat as they understood it from a leader. They thought someone was an enemy, therefore we need to show him that the Romans are boss and we need to dominate. But they haven't wanted to get involved. They haven't wanted to govern. They haven't wanted to create permanent provinces. That has only been done with great reluctance half a century later, after three more wars in Macedonia and the Seleucids, and they eventually set up this province. As they're starting to do, some other provinces are appearing around about the same time. Africa, you'll soon get Transalpine Gaul as well. So there is a sense the Roman Empire is expanding in its territorial commitments. But its influence has extended much earlier, and it has involved itself in the politics, in the interstate relations in the Eastern Mediterranean from very early on. Particularly, they've done it to some extent in the First Macedonian War, but it becomes more and more pronounced. After all, the Second Macedonian War and the defeat of Philip V and Rome's increased influence in southern Greece provokes the Aetolians to appeal to Antiochus III, which prompts him to intervene, which leads to the war between the Romans and the Seleucids. So these things tend to, one thing leads to another. There is a tendency of a sort of snowballing effect where you end up with one conflict creates the situation where another one will arise. So that's been the story we've looked at today. I haven't, as we've gone along, analysed too much all the different aspects, but we'll think about these things as next time we come on to a more general discussion of just what the driving forces are behind Roman imperialism. Why do the Romans succeed? We've looked a little bit at why they're successful in terms of their military system, but we'll look at that as well and try to see whether there is some inevitability about this. You know, does their military system, it makes them strong, but are they forced to use it to keep it in that position of strength or not? We'll look at the wide range of modern interpretations of Roman imperialism that have developed particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and up to today, and we'll try and balance those and see what strengths and weaknesses each of those have. We'll look at that, and then we'll build on beyond that. We'll be looking more at Roman expansion in the other direction. So when we've discussed imperialism, we'll keep on this theme for a while, and we'll look at Roman and the Romans and the tribal peoples of the Western Mediterranean, whether in North Africa, but particularly in Spain, in Gaul, and areas like Illyria and this sort of thing. And Liguria and Cisalpine Gaul in the first place, because those were major commitments. You know, Flamininus gets his extra year of command because the Romans are busy. They're more scared of a war in northern Italy, because after all, if things go badly there, then the enemy can be outside Rome, or certainly into Roman territory, much, much sooner than if things go badly in Macedonia. So more Roman soldiers and more commanders go off and fight in the West than have fought these wars we've talked about today. Because the wars that occur in the Eastern Mediterranean, although big, although prestigious, although famous, are relatively brief in duration, and there aren't that many of them. Whereas most years there is some conflict with the people in the West. So that's something else we need to look at. So this session, next time, and the following one will all be interrelated, because we're all talking about different aspects of Roman expansion, Roman imperialism, and its impact on the Romans. Because again, we've already talked about the mass enslavement of Epirus. We'll be looking at questions like that. We'll be looking at the impact of mass enslavement, slaves coming onto the market, coming into Italy, but also wealth coming into Italy. You know, the emphasis on the incredible splendor of Aemilius Paulus's triumph over Perseus, how much money he brought back, how much of that went into the hands of his soldiers, but also into other, the aristocrats in particular, the leaders of these big wars, but also the businessmen and others involved in it. So all of this is interrelated. So next time it's imperialism as a theme, and then following on from that, we'll look at imperialism in the West and try to draw out similarities, aspects of it, some of the topics we've talked about and all the others. But for the moment, that's it for the conquered and the proud.